Could I ask you now to give a very warm welcome to Jeremy Scahill, great filmmaker who he reminded me we first met when he used to call me up from the Amy Goodman show and ask me to do interviews, and he was ever so polite. I was really impressed. That's particularly when he calls at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he'd done a fantastic series of films on wars, and I was going to advertise his film that's showing tonight, but unfortunately all the tickets have gone. So I don't know what we do about that, other than show it again somewhere else. But could you give a very warm welcome to Jeremy Scahill?
Thank you for that, and I do apologize for waking you up in the middle of the night.
You're welcome anytime.
As the lone American on the panel, I'm happy to try to get it to Barack Obama, although I'm not in the best state with him. It's an honor to be with all of you. We're in a moment right now in the world where there is a war against journalism, and there is a war against individual liberty and freedom. And that war is being waged by powerful nations that claim to hold the mantle of democracy and civilization. In some countries, like Mexico, journalists are murdered every week by narco cartels or forces allied with the Mexican government. In Somalia, record numbers of journalists are being killed. There are at least 24 journalists missing right now in Syria. And in the United States, the administration of Barack Obama is targeting whistleblowers and prosecuting them under the 1917 Espionage Act, which was passed in the United States to target collaborators with the Germans. It is now being used to target people who work within the U.S. national security apparatus and have the audacity to blow the whistle on abuses of the United States Constitution and on basic moral principles. Journalists are having their metadata tracked, phones monitored, communications intercepted, in an effort to discover who we're talking to without authorization or permission. This White House is a leaky sieve itself when the details make it look like it is a heroic administration. In the aftermath of the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, U.S. officials were leaking details about that raid left and right. We were told that there was a dog named Cairo on the raid. That was a Belgian Malinois. Turned out to be completely false. We were told that Osama bin Laden grabbed one of his wives and threw her in front of himself, and the SEALs bravely maneuvered their weapons around him to shoot him in the face before he could grab a gun and shoot them. Totally false. We were told that there was this epic firefight and they had to shoot their way into the compound. Totally false. John Brennan, who now is the CIA director, gave the first public statement on behalf of the administration and has had to retract almost every single thing they said in the aftermath of the Osama bin Laden raid. At the same time, the White House is carefully managing its own messaging and leaking information to journalists who are members of a very pliant press corps. You have people like Chelsea Manning, who is doing a decade in prison right now for exposing what are very clearly U.S. war crimes and American dirty tricks around the world. And you have Thomas Drake, a former NSA analyst, who spent his career working in the intelligence community, considered himself a patriotic American, and when he discovered that there were programs he was working on at the NSA that he felt violated the U.S. law, represented abuses of the Constitution, he did what they claimed that Edward Snowden should do. He didn't go to Hong Kong and pass sensitive or classified documents to Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, though I think he was right in doing that, Edward Snowden. Thomas Drake did what they say Snowden should do, which is to report it internally, go up your chain of command. And when he did it, they charged him with espionage, simply for reporting internally these abuses. So Edward Snowden did the right thing if you looked at that case of Thomas Drake. Now, they weren't able to get Thomas Drake locked up behind bars, but Thomas Drake lost his job at the NSA and now works at an Apple store at a Genius Bar fixing iPhones and computers. William Binney, another NSA official, did the same thing and started blowing the whistle internally. He was in the shower one day when federal agents kicked down his door and dragged him out of his home, and they tried to ruin him as well. So when Edward Snowden decided to blow the whistle on abuses, he saw what happened to the people who did what they say you should do, which is go up your chain of command. And instead he went to journalists that he trusted. And the reason he did that is because in the United States, under our First Amendment, the trade of journalism is the only specifically cited profession. The reason is when you have the three branches of the American government colluding against the interests of the people, there has to be an additional outside check. And what is happening right now is that the Obama administration is undermining the existence of a free press in a society that purports to be democratic. It is as though they want only official media. They do not want journalists talking independently to people within the national security apparatus, even if those individuals have clear evidence of crimes that the government is committing against its own people. In the book that I wrote and in the film, if some of you have seen it, I tell the story of a brave Yemeni journalist named Abdullah Haider Shaya. Abdullah Haider Shaya is one of the best journalists in modern Yemeni history and is one of the most nuanced reporters in covering Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the covert US war in Yemen. He came to international prominence after President Obama authorized a secret bombing campaign in Yemen that began in December of 2009. On December 17th of that year, President Obama gave the green light to a cruise missile strike on a small Bedouin village called Al-Majla in Abyan province. And he was told by his intelligence officials that it was an Al-Qaeda training camp. And they wanted to hit it with drones, but all of the drones were being used over Pakistan at the time. So they used a cruise missile attack instead. And they dropped cluster bombs on this village. And if any of you have seen the aftermath of cluster bombs, they're like flying landmines. And they shred human beings into ground meat. They launched this attack on this village. And then the Yemeni government issues a release saying that its forces conducted a counterterrorism operation and carried out strikes against an Al-Qaeda camp, and they killed 34 Al-Qaeda terrorists, and they destroyed the camp. And then the White House sent a note of congratulations to the Yemeni dictatorship, thanking them for their commitment to fighting terrorism. Well, this journalist, Abdullah Haider Shaya, went to that village, and he videotaped the aftermath of it. And it is horrifying footage of the bodies of women and children dismembered and strewn across this barren mountainside. Tribal leaders told me that when they went there, they couldn't even tell the difference between human body parts and animal parts when they were seeking to try to bury the dead. What was most significant about what this journalist did is when he filmed the munitions that were used, he sent those pictures to international human rights organizations, who then had them reviewed by munitions experts. And they determined beyond a shadow of a doubt that the only nation in the world that possessed the weapons used in that bombing was the United States of America. And that report that he did went all around the world, and the public was made aware of the fact that the United States had started to bomb Yemen. Soon after he exposed that attack, he began going on international media outlets like Al Jazeera and talking about the intensifying air war, not just with cruise missiles, but then the use of Predator and Reaper drones in Yemen. And he was walking down the street one day in the capital, Sana'a, and was snatched by Yemeni intelligence officials and was taken to a political security prison and was beaten bloody and told that if he didn't shut up, if he didn't stop talking about the American bombing campaign, if he didn't stop interviewing people from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that they were going to put him in prison for good. And he did what I think was the brave and right thing to do. When they released him and dumped him back on the street, he went home, he changed his clothes, he went on television, and he said, "I was just beaten by Yemen security forces. They're trying to shut me up about the American bombing, but I will not be silent." A few months later, his house was raided in the middle of the night, and he was disappeared for 34 days. He was then brought into a specialized tribunal in Yemen that was set up specifically by the dictatorship to prosecute journalists and political dissidents for crimes against the state. And he was put on trial in a sham courtroom, in a process that was condemned by every major human rights and media freedom organization in the world, and then was sentenced to 5 years in prison for being an Al-Qaeda facilitator. That's the term that they used. When he was sentenced, there was huge outcry in Yemen. Massive billboards were put up demanding his release because he was known as a journalist who was not in the pay of anyone. He was critical of Al-Qaeda, he was critical of the dictatorship, and he was exposing a covert American war that was intensifying by the day. And there was huge pressure in the year leading up to the anniversary of his imprisonment from tribal leaders, from civil society, from international officials. And the dictator of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, decides he's going to pardon Abdullah Haider Shaya. News leaked in the media that day, in the Yemeni state media, that this was going to happen. That afternoon, the dictator of Yemen received a phone call from the White House. Not from someone on the National Security Council, not from some undersecretary of blah, 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 but from President Obama personally. And President Obama personally told the dictator of Yemen that the United States wanted Abdullah Haider Shaya kept in prison. The pardon was torn up that afternoon, and he remained in jail for 3 years. He remained in jail for 3 years because the Nobel Peace Prize winning constitutional lawyer, Democratic President of the United States, made a phone call and said, "We want you, Mr. Client State Dictator, to keep one of your own citizens in prison for having exposed our covert bombing campaign in your country." Abdullah Haider Shaya was freed 2 months ago, largely because of the work of international journalists and human rights workers inside of Yemen. But the United States has imposed conditions on him where he's not allowed to have a passport. He's not allowed to leave the capital, Sana'a, and they have banned him from engaging in journalism. This is part of the war on journalism also. Next weekend, I'm going to Geneva with a great journalist, Iona Craig, who's a reporter for the Times of London, to receive a prize on Abdullah Haider Shaya's behalf because he won't be able to go himself. This is the price that journalists are paying in countries around the world for having the audacity to be independent. And it is shameful that the American and British media outlets that use the reporting of people like Abdullah Haider Shaya or journalists in Somalia who get killed or wounded are silent in the face of attacks on these journalists. We are in a moment where we need fierce independent journalism more than ever. When a Democratic president of the United States is presiding over a global assassination program, when the revelations about the British and American intelligence agencies doing surveillance on ordinary people, on political dissidents, on various international leaders around the globe, where they are vacuuming up all of our data, where the U.S. is asserting that it has the right to assassinate its own citizens without trial or without charge, as well as non-American citizens, which represent the vast majority of the people killed in America's wars. We're talking about the threat that the Obama administration and that some within the British government tried to co-sign to attack Syria. The United States is already intervening in Syria. The CIA is funding some of the most reprehensible forces inside of Syria. They are training so-called rebel groups. There are mercenaries that are on the ground. Qatar and Turkey are acting as proxies for the United States and other Western powers. This isn't just about stopping a cruise missile attack, which is what Obama wanted at that time. It's about addressing the fact that the United States is already involved with perpetrating the violence inside of Syria today. I believe that Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal. I believe that he should be brought to justice. But no one can bring someone like Assad to justice with any credibility when the United States blocks the existence of an international criminal court that would also have jurisdiction over war criminals like Donald Rumsfeld. We see it regularly. The United States and Britain have a selective application of when human rights abuses become unacceptable. If you look at the uprisings in the Arab world, you saw Barack Obama's administration holding on to Hosni Mubarak for dear life until the bitter end. Hosni Mubarak was a client of the United States. He was one of the main supporters of the Extraordinary Rendition Program. Syria also supported the Extraordinary Rendition Program. Ask Maher Arar, the Canadian citizen who was kidnapped at JFK Airport and then sent to Syria by the CIA to be tortured by Assad's forces. When these governments are clients of the United States, their human rights abuses don't matter. But if you're the Saudis, if you're the Bahrainis, don't worry about it. The Fifth Fleet of the US military, it's based in Bahrain, you're okay. You can kill all the protesters you want. The Saudis are one of the most repressive governments on earth. But as long as you keep those oil profits flowing, it's okay that you have a dictatorship and don't actually allow any democratic process. But if you dare to stand up and say, we want an alternative way of life, we want to live under a different system that doesn't have as its central goal servicing corporations in the United States and in Western Europe, well, that's not going to be acceptable. And we are going to put the microscope on every human rights abuse that you commit. The US is a major funder of the Turkish military's slaughter of Kurds. And yet Turkey remains a major ally. So there's a selective application of when massacres are acceptable and when they're unacceptable. And in closing, I want to say this. The reason that we called our project Dirty Wars was not because we wanted to be masters of the obvious. There's no such thing as a clean war. But President Obama has used his credibility, particularly among liberals in the United States, to somehow argue that he has reinvented a modern iteration of the just war theory, and that he has somehow figured out a way to clean up war, that drones somehow are this wonderful alternative where you just sort of surgically pop the terrorists off the face of the earth. We don't even know how many innocent civilians have been killed in drone strikes, in part because John Brennan, the drone czar of America, has created a mathematical equation that applies to Pakistan and Yemen in particular, where anyone who is a so-called military-age male that is killed in a US drone strike is posthumously declared to have been a militant, or their favorite phrase, suspected militant. The United States is engaged in something called signature strikes. There are two kinds of drone strikes: a personality strike, as was used in the case of Barack Obama assassinating one of his own citizens, Anwar al-Awlaki, who had not been charged with a crime. His extradition had not been requested. They knew his location for a month before they killed him in a tiny village with 10 houses. And yet Obama served as the prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner of this American citizen. That was a personality strike. A signature strike is where they're monitoring your metadata, and you've been in this mosque with your phone, and then you've been at this meeting, and you've been calling these 5 people, and they don't necessarily know your identity. They may not have any evidence. In fact, it's likely they don't have any evidence that you're involved with any terrorism. You just meet the signature profile of a terrorist according to their algorithm. And they decide that you're going to die in an act of preemptive war, where if there's a chance that you may in the future be involved with terrorism, the United States wants to just go ahead and wipe you off the face of the earth. It's a grotesque form of pre-crime, like the Philip K. Dick novel, Minority Report, that was made in the Tom Cruise movie. The US is waging preemptive war across the world, and in the process is making more new enemies than it is killing actual terrorists. And those new enemies are not necessarily going to be terrorists. They're going to be people with a legitimate score to settle, because their pregnant wife was killed in front of their eyes in a night raid in Afghanistan, or their children were killed in a drone strike in Yemen. I open by saying that I think that it's absolutely essential that Western journalists stand in solidarity with their colleagues throughout the world who are under attack and don't have the option of coming back to London or New York when the war is getting too tough. They live in the war zone. But that's also true when our liberties are under attack. And right now, throughout the Muslim world, people's very existence is being threatened by Western powers that believe they have the right to dictate what system of governance people should have, what should happen with the natural resources in their country, and who should live and die on any given day. They have the Terror Tuesday meetings at the White House where they order pizzas and Diet Coke and look at baseball cards of who should live and who should die going forward. Barack Obama has put a stamp of legitimacy and has sought to put a stamp of legitimacy on some of the most egregious aspects of the Bush-Cheney so-called counterterrorism apparatus. The message sent to the world right now is it doesn't matter who the President of the United States is. that person is going to be a president of empire. The only beneficiaries of this war, the only beneficiaries are huge war corporations. They're the only people, in the United States now, you know, corporations are people, according to our Supreme Court. The only entities that have benefited from this are huge war corporations, and those same corporations have purchased almost every member of the United States Congress in a legalized form of corruption called campaign finance. That's the state of affairs in the US. So unless we get serious about confronting the role of corporations in all of our lives and the ways in which they dictate our foreign policies, nothing is ever going to fundamentally change. That's the challenge we have here in Britain, and it's the challenge we have in my home in the United States of America. It's one struggle, the same struggle, and I'm happy to be in it with all of you. Thank you.
Jeremy, thank you very, very much for that absolutely brilliant expose of what the US administration and others have done, and thank you for defending genuine, real journalists who put their lives on the line to let us know the truth about the war on terror. Thank you very much for everything you've said this morning. If you're Twittering, please do hashtag anti-war, no hyphen, just hashtag anti-war, and then you can send out some notes of all the speeches that have come this morning. Jeremy, again, thank you so much. And is your film showing anywhere else at the moment other than tonight?
Yeah, it's at the Ritzy in Brixton.
When's that on? Every night?
It's
Ritzy, Brixton, all the time.
and then it's going to be in sites throughout the UK.
It's on general release, so it's a great opportunity for local stop the war groups and anti-war groups to leaflet outside when it's showing somewhere as a way of recruiting supporters and getting people activated. So bear that in mind. It's on the Ritzy all the time, and then obviously on general release.